Okay, it shows that we are live. Happy Wednesday. This is our Archaeology Day for our Museums from Your Home live streams. We are going to be live on the Moundville Archaeological Park and Museum's Facebook page. So it looks like we are live there, and I apologize in advance if some of my video is fuzzy. Having a little technical difficulty this morning, but if you can still hear me, that'll be good. We are also going to be live on the Office of Archaeological Research's Facebook page. So I'm just checking. Okay, it looks like we are good there. And one last thing to check is that we are also going to be live from the UA Museum's YouTube channel. So you can go over to youtube.com/UA Museums if you prefer to watch it on YouTube there. So it looks like we're live on all of the many platforms we are trying to stream to. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started today. Welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I'm the communication specialist for UA Museums. It's hard to say museums so many times. And joining me today is Lindsay Gordon, the Educational Outreach Coordinator at Moundville Archaeological Park. And I see we have a guest with us today. Would you like to introduce her?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So I have with me a good colleague and friend, Dr. Brooke Persons. She's the director of the Jeffrey Brown Institute of Archaeology at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. That was a mouthful. But thanks for joining us, Dr. Persons.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. It's exciting to be a part of this program.
Yes, thank you for being with us today. And just as a reminder, we're going to be here on Facebook and the UA Museum's YouTube channel. So we're going to be broadcasting from multiple locations. So use your preference and how you watch us. And you can ask us any questions or leave comments in the comment section. And our panel today will be able to respond to them. And as a reminder, this is live, so anything can happen, like bad video connections or something like that. So just hang in there with us and be patient in case we do have any issues. So now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, Lindsay, how should we get started today?
Well, today, Dr. Persons and I are going to talk about a project that we actually got to work on together. But before we do that, like Dr. Persons, I always tell people, tell us a little bit about your archaeology experience.
Sure. I currently am a professor at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga in the Department of Cultural and Social and Justice Studies. But prior to this, I was a part of UA Museums, working for the Office of Archaeological Research, and also did my graduate work at the University of Alabama, where I worked on both a master's and PhD.
Oh, awesome. And I know that one of your many talents in your specialization is Caribbean archaeology. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct, Lindsay. Actually, I started off wanting to work in the Southeast because I was so fascinated by Native American groups in the Southeast, but had the opportunity in graduate school to work with Dr. Jim Knight, who had an ongoing project in Cuba at that time, and I happened to speak Spanish, and here we are 20 years later. So maybe not quite 20, but...
Awesome. So one of the projects that I know we worked on together was the Main Street project. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about Main Street, which is a project that was basically a big infrastructure project in the U.S. Virgin Islands on the island of St. Thomas. Specifically, it was in the town of Charlotte Amalie. And this is kind of a really unique project to work on. And just from the outset, this was kind of a group project that Lindsay worked on, that I worked on, that several other individuals also at UA Museums at the time worked on, including Kate Crossan, Eric Stauder, and Carlos Solis. So this is a project that, they say it takes a village, but this is certainly that case. So I guess the Main Street project is kind of unique because this was a project that we started at the University of Alabama's Museums Office of Archaeological Research, and we're continuing it at UT Chattanooga, where I currently am. The project was located in St. Thomas, which you can see is kind of nestled in the middle of the Caribbean, which is the island highlighted here. Next slide, please. And the project is really interesting because unlike a lot of other archaeological projects where you kind of are able to plan in advance, this project was a little bit different than that because we had to actually document the archaeological resources as the construction work was happening on site. So essentially, the government of the Virgin Islands, they were doing a whole bunch of infrastructure improvements, which include things like sidewalks and sewer lines and manholes and water lines, kind of things that you don't really think about being associated with archaeology necessarily. But they had to get involved with an archaeologist because they were doing all of this infrastructure improvement within the downtown historic district of Charlotte-Amalie. So you can kind of see the general project outlined there on the left, and then on the right of your screen, you should be able to see kind of a view of what Main Street looks like at dusk. So it's kind of a nice picture. But Charlotte-Amalie as a town was founded in the 1600s and then was continually occupied and developed over time. And so the reason an archaeologist was involved also is because prior to this, in an earlier iteration of the project, whenever they were uncovering part of I think it was kind of a big prehistoric site was nestled underneath a sewer line. And so in 2014, whenever another team of archaeologists they were working to do some of the archaeological monitoring, which is what it's called whenever you're kind of watching construction happen and making sure that resources aren't impacted. During that original monitoring, they actually found a big prehistoric site kind of really nestled in between and underneath some of the existing sewer lines. So as a result, the University of Alabama Museums at that time had an archaeologist on site working for a period of about 3 years, where every time somebody put a shovel in the ground, an archaeologist was there to monitor, to make sure to kind of document whatever finds were being exposed, whether they were prehistoric or historic, and just make sure that we recorded and documented and recovered as much of the information as we could. I guess next slide. So this is kind of an example of what, excuse me, the type of resources that we're dealing with. So on the left, this is the Grand Hotel around the turn of the 20th century. And then that's what it looked like on the left in a postcard. And on the right, you can see what it looks like when crews are actually on site now excavating. I think this picture was taken in maybe January or February of 2019. So you can see the backhoe or the excavator out front in front of the old hotel. And this is why we were kind of concerned about, the potential disturbance of archaeological sites or features or deposits. Because these are, historic buildings, these are historic homes, historic hotels, potentially historic cemeteries, places that people were living and living for hundreds of years. Next slide, please. Lindsay, you're doing a great job with the slides. One of the most challenging things about this project, about Main Street, was that we were actually doing archaeology in the evening, which poses a bunch of issues because usually with archaeology, you're trying to be as observant and patient and cautious as possible. And then working in the evening poses a lot of challenges, right? So these were the types of things that we were observing. So on the left, that's I think a sanitary, maybe a stormwater drain. And on the right, those are electrical conduits and telecommunication conduit pipelines. So essentially, as the crews were working in the evening to replace all of the infrastructure, we would be on site while they were excavating. And the reason they were doing it at night was in part because this part of Charlotte-Amalie is also one of the most developed kind of downtown commercial districts. And so to do the work at night was the time at which it would kind of have the least impact to all of the local businesses and people who were always downtown, right? Right. So that also means that whenever we were doing archaeology at night, we had to be kind of extra cautious. I know last week, whenever Lindsay had her archaeology hat on, she had a safety vest and steel toe boots and probably a protective gear, and that was important for us to working around heavy equipment. But it also meant that we had to come armed with several really strong flashlights so that we could actually see and observe all of the artifacts and soil changes and deposits and et cetera in the soil. Lindsay, do you have any questions so far?
Well, I actually have when you were talking about the difference in the finding prehistoric sites. Can you talk a little bit about how prehistoric artifacts or the prehistoric peoples were different in the Caribbean than, I guess, what people would see in the Southeast?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of people know that the Caribbean is kind of nestled in between North and Central and South America. But the Caribbean is its own culture area that has its own history of human occupation. There are very strong ties with the indigenous groups that lived in the Caribbean, both with Central and South America. So the groups that lived here are mostly related to those indigenous peoples from those areas. There are not as many ties with the Southeast as what we would expect. The site that they ended up finding in the other section of the Main Street project was a Saladoid site, which is kind of an early migration of indigenous groups that made ceramics and engaged in agriculture. And by that point in time, were largely distributed throughout the Lesser Antilles. So some of the terms that are used to refer to the indigenous groups of the Caribbean are the Taino or the Arawak or the Caribs. And these are all terms that are pretty commonly utilized, although we could probably talk for a long time about what those terms actually mean and whether they're appropriate to apply in this case. But suffice to say that the Caribbean has a pretty long history of human occupation that is unique from the areas around it.
Awesome. With working at night, that was one of my first times working at night. I thought that was really interesting and cool, like all the precautions that we had to take. And again, with being visible and using a lot of lighting and trying to be as careful as we can. But yeah, I think that was very interesting, and I still think it was fun. So
yeah, it's challenging because, again, this is not like a typical project where you have kind of time to think about it in advance, right. as the teams were excavating and installing all of these infrastructure, Lindsay and I and other archaeologists were kind of on site to very rapidly assess what's there, kind of document it, argue for its preservation if at all possible, and then if not, document it so that that information was recorded if it had to be impacted in any way. Yeah, it was challenging though, that's for sure. It's not normal to work and do archaeology at night.
Well,
let's talk next.
Yeah, I was like, let's talk a little bit about the test unit or
sure. Well, and here are just a couple of examples of why this was important to do. A lot of people don't understand why archaeology has a role in infrastructure or environmental review, but this is why it's important. So here, this is a picture of one of the features that we uncovered. And if you look at it kind of from the top down, you'll see the top layer of modern day asphalt. That's the modern day road surface. Underneath that, you see kind of a block of concrete that serves as kind of a sub. Below that, you can kind of see a thin white line running across the middle of the profile. And that's actually a portion of the original 18th century road surface. So that's a section of the original roadway from historic downtown Charlotte Amalie dating to probably the 1700s. And it was not necessarily a prepared surface like we would think of it today, like poured asphalt, but it was leftover lime mortar, leftover lime and kind of rubble and other rocks and things that were kind of thrown out into the thoroughfare and that then eventually became compacted. So that's one of the types of features that we were there to document. Can you see that clearly, Lindsay?
Yeah,
Is there a way to highlight it or move the mouse?
It's like
just to show if anybody's watching.
Rebecca, do you have? There it is.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah, right there, exactly.
Yeah.
So, it's good. It's clear to see in a photo where we have plenty of lighting, but this is why it's kind of you had to be on your toes.
Yeah.
Thank you for showing that. So I guess maybe the next slide too. So here's another example of an intact historic foundation. So the thing to remember about this historic town, like a lot of historic districts, and like a lot of places, is that, if you think it's a good idea to be there, then so did somebody else. That's kind of what I always say about archaeology. So in this case, what we are seeing are if you were to go into downtown Charlotte-Amalie today, most of the structures that you see were built in the early to mid 1800s. Some of them date a little bit earlier than that. In this case, what we're probably seeing is maybe an 18th century structure that actually predates the 19th century structures that are on site and visible today. And so this is, you can see the linear brick that's mortared in place. And this was, again, a kind of a foundation that was exposed during those excavations and trenching. Next slide. So this is the unit, the area where Lindsay and I guess last February in 2019, were doing archaeology at night and excavating test units in the dark, trying not to, but it happened. Whenever the project was ongoing, and most of it was in the streets, but they also went into one of the kind of interior courtyards where when the trenching extended into that area, it exposed a really, really, really dense concentration of 18th century hand-blown glass and historic ceramics and pipe stems and kind of a very typical historic assemblage for the colonial Caribbean. We worked with the developers and the contracting crews and the construction crews and got permission to excavate a formal test unit inside this kind of historic courtyard, which you can see on the left. This is the opposite end of the courtyard, but those are old modified bake ovens that would have since been modified, but would have been a part of a domestic unit. And then over on the right, you can see some of the rubble associated with the excavations. But right in front of that door, which is the red door on the right in front of that and kind of below it, that's where Lindsay and I excavated a small unit that measured about 2 meters by about 60 meters and 60 centimeters in width. Lindsay, if you want to click to the next one. And the reason we selected this location was because this is actually where they were going to put some of the piping in, right? So we didn't go just willy-nilly in any direction. We literally excavated within where the infrastructure was going to be impacted, where the infrastructure was going to be replaced. So here's a picture of the test unit before we started out. What's kind of cool about this is that you can see the concrete step, which is modern, right? And then below that step, on kind of the left portion of this screen, you can see the stone, which is kind of a dry laid stone. So that's locally quarried stone right there in St. Thomas. And that's actually the early 1800s floor of what that courtyard would have actually been covered in at that point in time. And for an archaeologist, this is pretty exciting because what that meant was that there was no modern disturbance below this floor. So we were really dealing with a sealed deposit. And so on the right hand of that on that unit, you can see we've removed the floor there, but on the left hand, it was still in place. Lindsay, can you think of anything else that we need to mention about this unit right now?
I can't. And Rebecca is our lovely Vanna White right now.
Okay.
But yeah, I just thought that was cool. That was also my first time seeing a deposit like that. So that's really cool to see the differences in the architecture, I guess.
Yeah, it's a different style of architecture. So at this point, and part of the reason it's different is that during the point at which this courtyard would have been occupied, which we have come to realize would be the 1820s and very early 1830s. At least that was the deposit that's the deposit that we ended up excavating. That's when it dates to. But during that time, St. Thomas and Charlotte-Amalie would have been a part of the Danish West Indies. So they were formerly a Danish colony associated with the nation of Denmark prior to 1917, when the U.S. Virgin Islands actually became a part of the United States as a U.S. territory. Okay, so that's kind of the reason that the architecture looks a little bit different, because these are kind of influenced by Danish architectural trends, which are different than the Southeast for sure. Next slide. So this is a little bit of what the excavations looked like, and you can see from the shadows that this is it's at least dusk, if not evening time. But this is a couple of levels into the unit. And then if you look on the left hand of where that arrow is, what was so interesting about this project was that we uncovered just mountains and mountains of historic ceramic. You can see a little bit of it there, all of those little blue and white flecks. Those are historic tableware. So they're plates, they're dishes, teacups, things like that, right? So think the same kind of tablewares that we would use today if you were to sit down and eat and serve a meal. And and Lindsay can back me up here, but there were times as we were excavating the unit that there were probably there were more ceramics than soil.
Yes.
It was just so dense. Usually even from a dense site, you may get a kind of a moderate amount of materials, but we were filling 12 or 13 kind of gallon sized bags full of artifacts from just one excavated level, which is only 10 centimeters, which is actually pretty small. So the end result of this was, let's see, we excavated the unit. I think we ended up going to about 1.30 meters below surface. I think that's when we started to hit groundwater and also sterile soil, which means that there aren't any artifacts in it. And what was so neat about it, kind of going back to the last slide, just thinking about it, but this really was a sealed deposit. So there was no modern disturbance. So this is really a glimpse at what was happening in this location from whenever that floor was built and below, which is a really incredible thing for an archaeologist. And Lindsay did a wonderful job of screening and of excavating. I think it took us, because there was so much material, we excavated this unit over a series of a couple of days, several days. And then it has taken us quite a while to kind of continue with the processing and analysis and the cleaning and washing and et cetera. Are there any questions so far that we need to address or?
Not yet.
Okay.
Rebecca, do you have any questions?
Let me pull myself back in here. I just had just questions about how you got into studying these things, especially with this project. What led up to wanting to go in here and study this?
Well, so this was a kind of a unique project. The Department of Public Works, which is a part of the government of the Virgin Islands. They had received federal highway funds to do the infrastructure project associated with this archaeological monitoring project. So because there were federal funds that were involved in this project, that kind of kicked in an environmental and archaeological assessment. And so we were a part of that. That's how we ended up, hanging out at Main Street from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. for a period of 3 years. I ended up in the Virgin Islands thanks to kind of, I had the opportunity to go work there in St. Croix first, and then later in St. Thomas and St. John. It was a little bit different than where my research was in Cuba, but it was it's a lovely place. The historic and prehistoric archaeology there is an incredible history.
Were there any things that you learned about working on this project that you didn't anticipate when you went in?
Yes, I've learned more about historic ceramics than I ever thought that I would know. So that's actually kind of where the next couple of slides are headed.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I didn't mean to jump in there and predict the future.
This is just a really unique project where, as I mentioned, this is a project that was started at UA Museums and done with the Office of Archaeological Research. But in December, we transferred ownership of all of the materials over to me here at UTC, and we are continuing our analysis of these materials. So in the course of this project, we've learned how to do archaeological monitoring at night. Monitoring is, again, kind of it's different than the more controlled and calm and cool and collected excavations that you normally think of or would associate with archaeology. So being a part of that monitoring is kind of a unique experience. But really, this is a kind of a singular collection. To have such a densely concentrated assemblage from a single event, a single deposit, is pretty rare, or at least has been in my experience in the time that I've been working in the Virgin Islands and the Caribbean. And what was so interesting about it, as we were excavating, we kept finding all of this burnt material. So burnt glass, a lot of charcoal, a lot of charred artifacts. And over the course of the excavations, what we our kind of working hypothesis has been that this assemblage that you're about to see a couple of photos of was actually generated from a town fire that occurred on New Year's Eve on the transition of 1830 to 1831. And the reason we know that, in part, is because we're able to date by the decoration and the type of material and the form and the kind of which you'll see in just a second, a couple of examples. But also because there are these beautiful hand-drawn maps in the Danish National Archives that say, hey, it's a beautiful map. It says, here's the extent of the damage from this town fire that occurred on New Year's Eve in 1830, 1831. So knowing that our project area fell within that boundary, we've been kind of trying to break that hypothesis or bust it, right? So if we could find anything in this assemblage that post dates 1830 New Year's Eve, then we have to look for an alternative explanation. So that's part of the reason why we've been trying to do more detailed analyses in the ceramic assemblage that we do have, so that we can kind of figure out whether or not we're correct in associating this with that particular town fire.
That's really neat. What I've learned as someone who does not have any experience in archaeology, what I've been learning from these live streams is that story and learning about the information of the place and the thing that happened is really important to the artifacts that you find. The artifacts are great, but learning more about the history of those things. So I was actually about to ask you, like, how do you know? How can you piece that together with, actual resources from the time? So that I personally find that very fascinating.
Yeah, we're working to utilize every resource that we can. So a lot of this is available thanks to the broader digitization of historic records, which has been ongoing over the last decade, but is certainly ramped up even now, thanks to UA Museums at Home. But so we're looking at primary archival material from the era that is available in the Danish National Archives, which would otherwise be located in Copenhagen and inaccessible from my living room. But they've done a great job of putting a lot of their Virgin Islands material online, which makes it accessible not only to researchers like myself, but also to the people of the Virgin Islands to whom it's most important. So we're utilizing historic maps, historic archives. We are also trying to, we'll actually be working this fall to try to dig a little bit deeper into the archives to see, myself and a student here at UTC, to see if we can kind of apply historic research methods to archaeological assemblages and see if we can, what we can learn about this property.
That's so really cool.
Yeah, it's a really unique glimpse at what was going on in this very specific location at a very specific time when everything was burned. And then they kind of chucked everything out of the house or out of the storefront into the courtyard and then built a new floor to build the new construction that's there right now.
Wow.
And when I say new construction, I mean like 1830s, right?
That's quite the dramatic story of, a fire and all that kind of stuff. Wow. Well,
And as an archaeologist, I also thought it was cool because most of my experience has been in the Southeast. So going there, this was my first time we talk about stratigraphy and looking at the different layers, like how clear the layers were with all of the dense deposits of artifacts. I thought that was really, really cool. Because that's probably the most dense assemblage that I've ever seen. So
yeah, I think from this small unit, which is 2 meters by 60 centimeters and about 1.30 meters in depth, I think we maybe have nine or 10 boxes of material, which is a lot of material. And what's so cool about it is that a lot of it is actually pretty redundant in terms of the types of historic material that we were seeing, which so kind of again, working hypothesis is that this is probably associated with a storefront or some kind of commercial entity where they were selling the same types of wares rather than a household where you would expect to see a lot more diversity. So maybe if we want to go back to just show a couple of people, go back to the PowerPoint just to show a little bit of the types of things that we're talking about. So this is a pearlware, refined earthenware pearlware plate. So they're showing up in our assemblage at Main Street. It's like 9 and 10 inch dinner plates, basically. And on the left here are examples that we excavated. And on the right, this is what the plate looks like in its entirety. And so the way we were able to identify it is by kind of matching up the rim patterns, also the shape of the vessel, and then the different decorative elements. And then we were kind of looking at them in our assemblage and then trying to find what they actually refer to, right? So in this case, you can see the daffodils and the floral print, also that kind of banded rope along the rim. And then you can also see the gentleman there on the bottom left. And if we were able to zoom in on this picture, which we can't, that's him on the right. And so we know from the kind of extensive historic resources that are available to help us identify historic ceramics that this is a print that was really widely made in 1825 by Ridgway Ceramics, by the Ridgway potters who were in the Staffordshire region of England. And it was made in 1825. So I was pretty thrilled to be able to identify this particular ceramic because we found a lot of it in the assemblage. And then again, kind of going back to building a narrative and trying to understand what this assemblage actually dates to. This was beginning to be produced in 1825, so this still fits within my hypothesis of that New Year's Eve fire of 1830. If you want to go to the next one. So this is another ceramic pattern that was pretty widely represented in the Main Street assemblage. So this is the Wild Rose pattern, which is actually pretty amazing. So you can see the different identifying pieces there on the bottom left. You have a manor house in the background, which you can see both in our sherd and then on the plate or on the dish platter, I guess. A pretty distinctive fisherman there in the bottom of the bottom triangle. Yes, thank you so much. You have some gentlemen on the shore. You also have some folks fishing, and then you can see the same thing in the ceramic print itself. You also have a really distinctive kind of thatch roof and bridge pattern that is evident both in our ceramics and then also in the dish plate. So back to kind of Rebecca's question of how we figure out what we're dealing with. Well, this is how, right? We take pictures, we clean everything, we wash everything, we start counting it, and then we look to other resources to see if we can help, if we need additional help identifying what these resources are. So far, this plate and with this pattern specifically, again, it's kind of a widely distributed, widely known pattern, but it was beginning to be produced in 1830. So if I go back to my hypothesis of whether or not this works as my New Year's Eve town fire on the cusp of 1831, this would still be within the time frame of production for to fit that hypothesis. And again, this is showing up in the assemblage that we have as kind of really large platters, just like you would see here, which are for, kind of a formal dining setting. Maybe next slide. And so this one is a very rather grainy photo of one of the other ceramic types that is pretty common in this assemblage, and it's called the Gleaners, and that's a reference to corn harvesting. But you can see, again, the young lady pictured there in our ceramic on the top left. And then that's the woman standing, right? Exactly. And then again, we also matched up the rim pattern. So that piece of rim that you see on the right is represented in this whole plate. And then again, this is another ceramic pattern that was made in 1824, also from the Staffordshire region of England. So long and short of it, at least for the ceramics, so we're continuing to work on this at UTC, and we are trying to understand exactly the nature of this assemblage, to go beyond just, usually archaeologists are really concerned with just kind of chronology, because the decoration and the type of ceramics that are present tell us when a site was occupied. But in this case, we want to know a little bit more, right? Because we have so much data and we have so many, huge sherds of the same ceramics replicated over and over and over again. So what we're trying to do is to piece together kind of an economic, an understanding of how, let me see if I can put this correctly. We are trying to piece together an understanding of kind of the economic scaling of Main Street. So if we were to look at this assemblage, for example, and try to figure out, is this kind of just an everyday household item that's being sold? Or is this something that is kind of representative of a higher socioeconomic status, right? Of people who are either buying or selling it. We're trying to kind of complete this analysis across the Main Street collection. So to do that, we are measuring each individual rim sherd to try to figure out whether or not it's a bowl or a plate or a saucer, and if so, how big is it, and how many of them are represented, so that we can kind of get a better understanding of exactly what was for sale and kind of what that tells us about domestic life in St. Thomas in the 1820s and 30s. Lindsay, do you have any questions so far?
Yeah, I was wondering from a lab standpoint, like, have you been able to put like a whole plate together yet?
So, good question. we have some large chunks and large pieces. Okay. So I think so far the biggest section that let me put it this way. If I were to Photoshop it, yes, I could probably kind of piecemeal pieces. But yeah, the largest single section from a single plate that I've been able to piece together is probably a 30, maybe like a 15 or 20 centimeter block.
Okay.
So because these are large serving platters. So not a whole plate, but we're piecing a lot of the pieces. That's part of why the analysis is taking so long.
Yeah. It's like, that's really cool.
So one of the things that we're also doing at UTC that I'm excited to be involved in is, this kind of also goes back to Rebecca's question about, what new things I'm learning in this process. So we're also embarking on a program of conservation, right? Because so we've excavated it, we've kind of washed everything, it's all dried. Right now it's sitting in boxes waiting for us to analyze it. Because this material was kind of periodically submerged and it's been excavated and it's kind of been taken out of the soil context in which it was previously, it's corroding rather quickly because it's kind of moving from that mixed, periodically wet environment into a totally dry one that is now air conditioned. And so you can see up at the top left, that's a button and a button back. So what you're looking at is the back of the button and then the little loophole that the thread would have gone through, right? And you can see that the little loop is corroded off. So all of that green stuff and all of that rust is kind of slowly eating away the artifact, right? So on the bottom left, one of the steps we've been kind of taking are a process to first remove all of the salt from the materials. And so we're doing that by successive baths of distilled water, and one of the ways that we're testing to see whether or not there's still salt in the water and whether or not there's still art that's contained in the artifact is, so on the right here, right where that red arrow is pointing, you can kind of see a milky fluorescence that's kind of, it's kind of coming off of the artifact. So what that is after we soak the artifacts in distilled water, we'll come back and kind of test the water to see whether or not there's salt present by adding a couple of drops of silver nitrate solution. And if there's salt present, then it will fluoresce in that kind of milky white way. And so we continue giving it distilled water baths until it's no longer until it no longer fluoresces. And then once it is cleared, if you'll go to the next slide, and then once all of the salt has been removed from the artifact, then we actually are starting a more kind of specific process of trying to get all of the bad stuff away. And usually archaeologists are not really in the habit of trying to remove materials from artifacts that are in a kind of a destructive way, right? But in this case, this material is so corrosive that if we don't do something, then ultimately this will kind of eat all of the metal that has this corrosive patina on it. And so one of the things we're doing also is just applying a really light, short citric acid bath, which will help kind of take off some of that material. Like you can see the water here is kind of tinted green a little bit. So that shows you that some of that corrosive material is kind of coming off of the artifact through this successive process. And then one of the final steps, if you'll go to the next slide, that we're going through is actually kind of more aggressively removing some of the rusted and corroded materials from the artifacts that are a little denser and can actually handle that kind of abrasive material. So this is one of our UTC students, Lori Robbins, who just graduated, working on conservation and actually utilizing a Dremel tool to kind of remove some of the rust, which is not something we would normally do, right? But in this case, that's one of the biggest challenges facing us right now with dealing with this collection, is kind of stabilizing it to a point so that it is long-term preserved. We will continue our conservation efforts. Unfortunately, they were kind of disrupted by the COVID-19 and us not being on campus this summer. But the good news is that we'll pick it back up as soon as it's safe to be back on campus. And the ultimate goal and the reason we're trying to work so hard to conserve all of this material is that ultimately, these artifacts were excavated in St. Thomas, and right now they're in my lab in Chattanooga. But the ultimate goal is for this collection to go back to the Virgin Islands, and we'd really like to work with local organizations there to build a kind of a local exhibit because, this material is from the Virgin Islands, it belongs in the Virgin Islands, and that's where it will kind of have the most impact in terms of helping people to understand, what their historic town is like.
Yeah.
So I guess so before we were looking at a button back, and the last picture, I didn't mention that, but that's kind of a key to a furniture. I don't know if you remember excavating this, Lindsay, but maybe like a clock key or a furniture key that you would have turned. So this is an artifact that's maybe 2 inches long, 2 to 3 inches long, and pretty sturdy. So that's kind of a general summary of where we're at with Main Street. We've gone from excavating at night, which is weirdly challenging, washing, and we're still in the analysis phase. And what's really been fantastic about this project is there's been a broad scale coordinated effort, not only on the part of all of the archaeologists who have worked there, like you, Lindsay, and all of the other people who have worked on there through UA Museums, but also the people who continue to work on it here at UTC so that it can ultimately go back.
That's great. Oh, we've got a question from Miss Randy Cottier. She asked, does the dominance of English ceramics indicate extensive trade with England at this time? And were the Danish ceramics of the same period recovered during your excavations?
So that's a really good question. So one thing to remember about this part of the Caribbean is that, if you look up in the distance, you can see islands from a number of different, that would have been associated with a number of different colonial powers actively within your viewshed. So standing in St. Thomas, which would have once been a Danish colony, if you look out, you can see a British colony, you can see Puerto Rico, which was a Spanish colony on a clear day, you can see Dutch islands, British islands certainly, and then the Danish, right? So the fact that we're seeing more British ceramics in this site, it's not really unexpected, because if there were any trade embargoes at any point in time, they weren't necessarily as readily applied or policed as in the colonies in the Caribbean as they were maybe in stateside colonies. And then beyond that, in the 19th century, there was such a dominance of the English, the Staffordshire ceramics, and their really, really widespread production of the pearlwares and the whitewares and et cetera. So that's a great question. Most of what we're seeing is all pearlware that's produced in England at that time. In some of the earlier levels of the excavation, which we are not really talking about here, but it was kind of interesting because in the upper strata, you could see this kind of very commercial assemblage. And then as you go down in the unit, you can see a shift to a more domestic, what looks like a more traditional domestic assemblage, in which you see a greater variety of different types of ceramic. So that would have included like Delft, also a little bit of, I think, yellowware, but we haven't really completely gotten to the analysis yet. So good question.
And then Catherine asked, is there an artifact that you found that stands out to you in that assemblage?
That's a great question. I should have included it, but one of the most interesting artifacts that I didn't even realize we had recovered was like an ivory domino from the Main Street excavations. And so if anybody knows anything about the Caribbean, it's kind of playing dominoes is a pretty common pastime. And it's pretty interesting that we would find a domino from the 1830s, and it just kind of shows a continued cultural association that I think would resonate. So that's one of the most interesting artifacts from this collection. We've also, one of the things that I didn't really mention, but so thank you for your question. One of the things that kind of the class of artifacts that we found in this assemblage also are a whole lot of items that are associated with personal adornment. So there were a handful of like brass earrings that had really beautiful faceted glass attached, or let's see. So I know there are a couple of rings also, and then a bunch of small pins, which are typically associated with historic clothing when people are pinning items on their in their personal clothing. So what I think is going to be pretty interesting about this collection is that not only will it tell us a little bit more about what was for sale and what people were buying and what people were able to buy, but it will also tell us a little bit more about, women and children and kind of what's happening within kind of a everyday historic household that's interrupted by a specific event. So
it's really cool.
So I have probably a dumb question. I don't know if it's a dumb question, but I have a question. So here on this slide with the student, I think you said she was removing rust from this. So how do you actually teach someone how to use that tool and do that? I mean, I don't know. Do you practice on the artifacts, or do you practice on something else beforehand? I know that's probably a silly question, but I was like, if it was me and I was having to hop in there, I would be worried that I would destroy the artifact or I would harm it in some way. How do you all go about, using those tools and how to protect the things that you're studying?
That's a good question. Safety first, always, right? No, we were testing it out on a couple of the historic nails that we recovered. So it's kind of the same material and it's similar issues. So we do it with less sensitive artifacts first and tried it out there and also on some other materials and kind of proceed. Right here, it seems like a very fast process, but in reality, it's painstakingly slow, very, very painstakingly slow, kind of taking weeks, if not months, to kind of do properly. And then this is obviously not even finished, because at the end, we'll kind of put it in a wax bath and hopefully seal as much of what we can preserve. So we proceed cautiously. Very cautiously.
It does seem like a lot of this work is you have to be patient. You have to wait for the baths to do their work so that some of that a corroded or eroded material would fall off it. So it seems almost like there's a waiting period. You do all this work and you do all this study, and then you have that. I'm also curious about, so were there any other tools that you had to use when you were doing some of that archaeology at night and things like that? What kinds of things do you all use?
Well, we have kind of the standard shovel and screen and, everything that you would see during the daytime. We also had a lot of really large stand lights and headlamps. And because we were working around heavy equipment, we always were wearing safety gear like steel toe boots and safety vests, and also hard hats were pretty critical.
Yeah, so, definitely don't want to get hurt.
a lot of lighting. That's what I'll say.
Yes, you have to be able to see what you're doing.
And so we were also trying to we tried to limit, at least with the test unit excavations. Also, we were trying to limit how those excavations during the evening. So most of our test unit excavations were during the day, kind of into dusk, and then the nighttime monitoring is kind of a separate event. But
and was coffee also something that played heavily into your archaeology at night? Is how do you all do you sleep during the day, and then is that kind of the way you all operate?
Yes, all of the above. Yeah, so the primary monitor on this project was actually an archaeologist named Kate Crossan, who did a wonderful job as the kind of the primary field monitor. And so some of us would fill in periodically. And so she's kind of working with me also on producing the final report, which I'm very excited about. But a lot of time was spent in downtown Charlotte-Amalie, hanging out between 6 p.m. and 3 o'clock in the morning, documenting archaeological features and materials. So it's a really interesting project to be a part of. And in the long run, I'm hoping that it'll be of interest to the people of the Virgin Islands whenever we're able to kind of get everything analyzed, conserved, everything written up appropriately, and then hopefully on display back where it was excavated.
Wow, that's really cool. Well, I had just one last question. We have about 8 minutes until we should probably wrap it up. But I'm very curious about how people become archaeologists, because that's a very specific career path and field. So were you interested in this kind of thing when you were growing up? How did you decide that one day you wanted to be an archaeologist?
Well, I think, and so I have an undergraduate, master's, and a PhD, all focusing in anthropology. And when I was an undergraduate, I had been kind of loosely interested in history, but when I took some history classes, I realized that wasn't really the case. Mostly what I was interested in was human variation. Humans are so strange, our behavior patterns, the way that we live, the way that we're also different, but also the same. And once I started taking classes as an undergraduate, I realized that anthropology was the discipline that would kind of allow me to understand human variation, whether that's looking at living peoples or people who lived in the past. And then through my undergraduate training in anthropology, I took a field school, and that was it. So it was kind of as a long-term career choice. It was a job that would kind of allow me to be both in the lab, but also in the field, which is something that I very much enjoy. And, I find it to be kind of challenging because every project is a little bit different. Every site is a little bit different. You learn new things all the time, or otherwise you're not really doing it right. And so, to be engaged in this type of field where we are helping to document heritage in a way that is longstanding and permanent, especially doing the work like UA Museums and the Office of Archaeological Research and the work we do here at UTC at the Jeffrey Brown Institute of Archaeology, where we're doing kind of mitigation projects where we're really trying to save and document what's there before it's impacted or destroyed in some way. So I think that's pretty critical because I view it not only as a service to the people who are the descendants of those communities, but it's just a great way to get involved and kind of protect heritage.
That's awesome. Well, we do have a couple more questions before we wrap up. Ronald asks, since Britain occupied the islands during the Napoleonic Wars, could that explain the large amounts of British artifacts? Is that anything that you all were looking into?
Yes and no, and that's correct. But at the same time, it is pretty common for such extensive, such high quantities of British ceramics to be found throughout the historic Caribbean during this time period. They were really mass producing the creamwares, the pearlwares, and the whitewares, which is why they're so common on archaeological sites. So that certainly could have had something to do with it. But even if these types of ceramics are extremely common across historic deposits and sites in the New World. Great question.
Yeah, and what I think is remarkable about the way you're going about these kinds of things is that you're willing to. I hope this doesn't sound bad. You're willing to be wrong in case there's new information that comes up that you find in your discoveries, that you're willing to adjust the hypothesis depending on new information that might come in. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah, there was a really interesting article about the archaeology of Star Wars that was published several years ago, and where people are trying to go out and find the sites in which Star Wars was, where the film locations, and so they were trying to excavate the film locations themselves. But they kind of I can't remember the author, but they described archaeology as a science where you kind of in the field come up with the most fantastic explanation that you can come up with, and then kind of scale it back and scale it back and scale it back towards what you feel like you can defend and what you can reasonably say, because we're making inferences about human behavior, which is notoriously variable and not always logical, and there's so much variation that it's hard to gloss over, or it's easy to gloss over a lot of that. There's let me rephrase that. It's my brain quit working. But there's so much variation that it is, I think, important to be aware of the nuance. So we can't really gloss it over. Every site's a little bit different. So I'm happy to be wrong if it moves our explanation forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now I'm going to have to investigate that archaeology of Star Wars. I bet they found little pieces of C-3PO's costume that probably fell off at some point while they were shooting the first one.
Yeah, it was. I think it was published in Harper's. It's a great article. I think I've got it somewhere. But they were, I think, finding bits of styrofoam.
Yeah,
that were parts of scenes. I'm not really a Star Wars person, so I don't know. But
that's really funny. Well, before we go, we do have one last question that we'll probably take. So Catherine asks, what advice do you have for anthropology students who want to pursue archaeology for their career?
Another good question. I think you should try to get some experience. Most anthropologists, a lot of them work in academia, but a lot of anthropologists do not, whether it's working for government entities or private sector. There are a lot of jobs. There are more jobs than what you think there are. So be open to those experiences. I started off working in the Southeast and applied to graduate school to do that, and ended up working in a totally different culture area on a totally different topic, and have since kind of worked on a range of different sites. So just being open to those new experiences is kind of a pretty critical part of it. Beyond that, just don't be scared to go out and ask somebody how to do the job that you want to do. If there's somebody that you admire, email them and ask them if they can help, or how they got there, right? And I guarantee you that if you are a student of anthropology, that your professors and your colleagues and other individuals in your department can probably provide some guidance in terms of looking for jobs and experiences. So jump into it. It's fun.
Well, that is great advice. Well, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Persons, and sharing about your experience not only with UA Museums, but what you're doing now with UTC and some of your work on a more, I guess, global scale. You're outside of the United States doing things that are at least outside of the mainland of what we, because I think the Virgin Islands are connected to the United States. Yes. I have that correct. Just to make sure I know my geography. So you're sort of connected to the U.S. in that project, but it's still outside of what we would consider the main 50 states. So I think that's really cool. And it's a good reminder that archaeology is a global activity, that it does happen around the world. But it's cool that we get to learn about your experience in a very specific place with a very specific history. So thank you for sharing that with us today.
Sure. Well, thank you all for the opportunity.
All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap up this Museums from Your Home live stream. As a reminder, if you want to learn more about our initiative here and where to find our live streams, what the schedule is, if you want to see past live streams, all of that information is at museums.ua.edu/museums from your home. That's going to be your one-stop shop for all of our information about what we're doing here. And if you're liking what we're doing here and you want to support UA Museums in our efforts to bring the museums to your home, you can go to give.ua.edu/museums, and that will give you the opportunity to become a supporting member. If you would like to keep up with all of our video content, if you don't want to look at the schedule and try to figure all that stuff out, you can just go subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/UA Museums, and that will notify you when we go live, so you won't miss any of our live streams. You'll get all of our video content, like our isolation observations and Lindsay's Moundville Mondays, so you can learn more about Moundville Archaeological Park. And so that is a good way to do that as well. Well, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us live, and for the people who are going to watch this later. Thank you for visiting UA Museums from your home. All right. Well, I hope everybody has a great day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.